in the world, but if so, I can imagine what they must feel as they wander through the gardens of the Kremlin. Neither feeling can rival mine right now. Not just interviewing Bill Rusher. I've been doing that since 1960, 1960. But finally, for the first time, being welcomed into the chambers of National Review, where it all began. It being a form of thought which, when it was first let out into the light of day, was viewed as either a pestilence or a freak show or a confession of private meanness. They call it conservatism. It is today, by far, the dominant political philosophy in the United States. I'm not talking about tomorrow. I'm not talking about Wednesday after next, but at least today, and not the White House, not the governor's mansion in California, but right here in this office in National Review in Midtown Manhattan is where modern American conservatism began.
Where the flame was tended when there wasn't anybody else to tend it.
Right.
I got it right over a little corner there.
And William A. Rusher, the guardian of that flame, now blowing it merrily into a global conflagration, not to destroy, but to warm, to enlighten, and to energize. And part of his fuel is between covers of How to Win Arguments. There's a link published by Doubleday.
Well, somebody called and said, how about being on a panel of 4 people to discuss thus and so, and one of the other panelists is going to be Bella Abzug. I said, no way. She cannot be controlled. She's a public menace, and I wouldn't mind debating her at all if there were only a way to get a word in edgewise. This guy said, well, don't worry. We have a fine moderator here, and he'll be able to control her. That's all been taken care of. I allowed myself to be talked into it. So we showed up that night, whatever it was, at the Hilton Hotel, and the thing was scheduled to go at 8 o'clock. And for some reason, I remember they were going to videotape it. It had to begin the videotape at 8 or thereabouts. So we began. Abzug was late, by the way. This is technique number 1. Everybody else is there. The moderator, the other 3 panelists, the audience, the technicians, the videotape people. Abzug is late. She was a congresswoman at this time. So there was nothing to do but go ahead, and the moderator called on one of the other panelists to make his opening presentation. And he made it for about 10 minutes, and I guess I made mine, and the third guy made his. And about halfway through the third guy, you heard out in the hall a clump, clump, clump. Here she came, hat and all, you know. Into the poor guy stopped his presentation. She came in. The entire audience, about 200 people, turned out to be about 75% her clack. They all went wild. Wild applause. Bella clunk, clunk, clunk up onto the stage, got on the stage, waved to everybody, shook hands with the moderator, waved to the other panelists, and sat down. It subsided temporarily, and the moderator said, Mr. Jones, whoever it was, would you please continue? He sat down, and the poor devil, whoever it was, finished what was left of his bedraggled presentation, and the moderator called on Congresswoman Abzug to make hers, and off she went for about 3 times as long as anybody else had taken. And when she was finally through, the moderator threw the floor open to questions. And that was the point at which I really nearly broke down into tears, because the 2 other people on the panel were sensible men. They should have known better. They were experienced. They were not naifs. And they both started their part of the panel session by saying, I'd like Congresswoman Abzug to tell me how she can say. Well, you get about that far, and Congresswoman Abzug has got the mic again, and you get another 20 minutes of how she can say, you see? And it was the most frustrating experience of my life. She lorded it over everything. She didn't let a word get in edgewise. She domineered from one end to the other. Her clack cheered like mad. And at the end of the evening, and mind you, I had been promised that the moderator was going to control this ape. And finally, she... the evening was over, and it was at the Hilton. I live on Murray Hill. I walked home. That wasn't enough to quiet me down. I took a Milltown when I got there. That finally got me to sleep. 1 week later, my dentist told me that my teeth showed distinct signs of recent grinding. I said, I can explain this exactly. I know when it happened.
Oddly enough, there is a publisher. I'll protect him. I won't mention his name. But he came on my show once upon a time with you, not knowing what he was getting into, and he walked around Central Park in Midtown Manhattan all night long afterwards for fear he had lost the world. What is the name of that?
Those days, you had to, I guess you could walk around Central Park all night long and live to tell the tale.
Exactly. Is there a name, either English or Latin, for that mistake? Mrs. Abzug, how could you possibly say that? In other words, kick me again, I'm still wiggling.
The name is in English, it's called stupidity. When you get the mic from somebody at any rate who is obsessively possessing it, you do not promptly ask them to explain something to you. You go after them.
You talk about you and the Admiral arguing about what would happen if we withdrew military support from South Vietnam.
Right. Well, there was an advocates program, television program, in about 1974. We were arguing for the fourth time on the program whether or not we ought to pull out all support from Vietnam. Of course, our own troops, I guess, had been out since 73. And Admiral LaRocque, a retired admiral who's mad at the Navy now and who heads some center down in Washington on defense matters, which is financed, as I recall, by Philip Stern. I could be wrong about that, but one of the left liberal operations, Admiral LaRocque was arguing that we ought to pull out on the Vietnamese, give them no more help at all, and I asked him, it was a question of the argument from consequences, what's going to happen? And he said nothing will happen. The Vietnamese have been fighting for many, many years, and they will keep right on fighting whether we support them or not. I said the other side is being supplied by Russia. He said, yes, I know, but still, they don't have enough. And I said, what if I told you they would collapse? He said, I wouldn't buy it. And there he stood, a retired Rear Admiral of the United States Navy, flatly saying that there was to be no consequence at all from the withdrawal of support for South Vietnam. And there wasn't an awful lot you could do about it other than I guess, just ask people's common sense to be invoked. What do you think? It didn't make any sense. That wouldn't have an effect.
It was questionably the best debater on the planet Earth, has broken open the arsenal and is passing out live ammunition to the consternation of his colleague, also a great debater, William F. Buckley, Jr., in a treasonous kind of way. Bill Buckley writes on the back cover of How to Win Arguments, Bill Rusher's act of treachery, giving away the House secrets, may make him rich and famous. At home, we will treat him like the Rosenberg.
I tell in the book two stories about Combs. One was how Buckley managed to stop Combs, and then how Combs used a variation of the same technique to stop me on a later debate. I heard Buckley and Combs on radio debating something one evening, and Combs was in the midst of a big, long sentence which was getting to some impressive effect about 2 or 3 dependent clauses away. And you were waiting for, here he came, just like man of war down the stretch, with his long sentence, Ciceronian periodic sentence. And all of a sudden you heard Buckley's voice, what turned out to be Buckley's voice, going sort of, oh, and all he was saying was, oh, I wouldn't say that, Mr. Combs, something like that. But that, oh, I call the Buckley glissando. It sounds like Norma in Casta Diva, floating above the chorus, And the point is that it was absolutely impossible to concentrate on what Combs was saying in that sentence. All you heard was that, oh, and whatever Combs was doing was just like the druids in the background, you see. Well, apparently Combs learned from that, or maybe he was just instinctively good, because later on WR, I had a little series with him called Let's Take Sides, where you heard Grandpa in the kitchen. And one night I had one of these sentences going, one of these long periodic things, which was going to sound good if I ever got it finished, And I was going on, and all of a sudden, instead of going, oh, and Combs began going, come, 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 come. Well, it's the same effect. You cannot possibly get anybody or yourself to concentrate on the sentence while you are going over what sounds like a rock fall of some sort. Come. It's like trying to play a violin while going over an ice fall below Mount Everest, you know? It's just two impossible things being matched together. And he blew my sentence apart. Very few, we're talking about specialty occasions. That might work in an open public debate, but it works best on radio, maybe second best on television.
But you used to feel that the entire world depended on this argument.
Well, you must understand, I grow out of a particular context and background, which is the conservatism of the early 60s and late 1950s. We were an embattled minority. We were sure that we were right, but we had very little support. We were thoroughly scorned as far as the major media were concerned. And being on a program like yours, frankly, was a great credit to you that you would listen to us and give us a forum. And we were tremendously grateful for that. And we now see, given your own subsequent history, that your own instincts told you that this was a live bird you were tracking here.
Exactly.
So that we have come a long way, and I suppose that our mood is a little bit different now. I don't know what you're suggesting about the different rusher, but it is true we've mellowed. It'd be wrong not to mellow when, after all, you're now in a position where the president says that National Review is his favorite magazine.
Principle here. When everybody around you says X, you tend to believe that you need no further support for X. That is enough. Mm-hmm. A lot of movie stars get into this trap. A lot of celebrities who are propelled into causes that I imagine they're your favorite adversaries, those who just are incandescent with the conviction that they are right, and anybody who opposes them is a very bad character.
Movie stars and so on, people like that. I haven't had too much to do with them. Donald Sutherland, as I said, but not too much. Yes, but you're quite right. They're very naive people. Obviously.
Everybody in their crowd thinks X, and therefore X applies. Well, you caught me in my liberal phase. Maybe I was going over the waterfall in my canoe in another 90 seconds if I hadn't met you just at that intersection.
I didn't realize I had snatched you back from the waterfall. You seem to be a thoroughly well-grounded man.
Well, point that I remember, you were reading me the galleys of an article you had just written before it was really clear if that election would stand. Apparently Nixon had a few hours to appeal the obvious frauds in Illinois and with the Illinois vote. And anyhow, I was saying, but if it's a tie, it'll go into the House of Representatives and can be settled by some congressman from Mississippi. And you say, well, what's so wrong about that? And it just never occurred to me that there wasn't everything wrong with that, but I couldn't tell you what was wrong with that. Once upon a time, I had you on the air with a Yugoslav communist official. And he said there is freedom of the press in Yugoslavia. In point of fact, just like there is conservatism in America, there is a lot more now than there used to be, and there's a lot more now than communists would prefer. Anyhow, this is thanks to the spirit of resistance and freedom of the Yugoslav population. Anyhow, you suggested you'd be happy to donate some couple dozen or hundreds of copies of National Review with a little paper attached, written in that wonderful Serbo-Croatian language, which is the language of Yugoslavia. And the word came back that there'd be no interest in National Review in Yugoslavia.
I remember it better than you do, as a matter of fact. This cat came on. It was on an election night, and you were pointing out how nice it was we had elections in this country. And he was being patronizing. You know, Yugoslavians are accustomed to being treated well by liberal opinion in the United States, because they're not exactly Russian. And I pointed out that he was simply the agent of one more dictatorship, and what was so big about him, you know? And, well, he said they had democracy in Yugoslavia, and I said, yes, does your Mr. Tito have to get elected? Oh, no, he says he is a personality.
Tito's a person.
Oh, No, he's a personality, is he? He'd have to get elected. Isn't he a lucky guy? So we then got on the question of what it was possible to publish and print and sell in Yugoslavia. And he said, sure, National Review could be sold there. Well, I said, Mr. Jones, or whatever his name was, wasn't Jones. He said, we'll find out just whether or not it's possible to sell you. So I sent about 2 dozen National Reviews all the way to Belgrade with a special note requesting that they be, we got the name, whatever the distribution system was in Belgrade, as you say, Serbo-Croatian, and a little explanation of what it was. We folded that into the magazine and said, kindly distribute these on your newsstands. And we got back naturally, as I knew we would, that they would not accept any such thing. It happened to have it, and I picked one that had a criticism of it. They weren't having any of that, so I then came back on your program and read at roughly this dictation speed a statement of what a gold-plated phony this character and his personality were. And he didn't even bother to show back up. As I recall, we invited him to come and explain. He didn't come, and he didn't explain. So he was just one more exploded little two-bit apologist for dictatorship.
That was my favorite
That's
Russia.
what's known as shooting fish in a barrel.
Yeah, exactly. These live forum.
Well, I think that over the years, the ones that gave me the most scope were those Advocates television programs in the 1970s. Actually, they've had them as late as last a year ago. They managed to scrape up some money to have some more. By the way, I did 2 of those for Reagan last year out of 5 the Advocates did from WGBH-TV in Boston. And you only got 1 witness because the program was an hour long and you had 3 people. Remember, Anderson was in the race, too, so there were 3 sides. And of the 2 shows I did, my witness on one was a young congressman named David Stockman, and the other was a retired general named Alexander Haig. How's that for picking them? I thought I was pretty good in selecting people who later turned out to be high in the Reagan administration.
The title is Yellow Rain. Yellow Rain. Mr. Seagrave, why did you pick that particular title?
Well, Barry, this was first coined by the hill people up in Laos when they were describing the chemicals falling out of the air. They said that Vietnamese aircraft came over their village and in various ways dropped powder that was yellow, that looked like a cloud of rain coming down, and sometimes it felt moist.
Gentleman on your right would have been impossible to get here a very few years ago. His last name is Krivitskis, Povilas Krivitskis. He is a correspondent for the Moscow Daily News. He is a Soviet journalist. Now, when we were talking to Mr. Krivitskis earlier today, we asked him if he'd like to bring somebody or if he could bring somebody, and I just can't believe my eyes because I am of the age that has to believe in miracles. We've seen many, and look what a miracle Povilas Krivitskis has brought us. Mr. Krivitskis, would you introduce your friend?
My friend is Andrei Volkunov, the correspondent of our main Soviet newspaper, Pravda, from Moscow.
Andrei Volkunov, thank you very much for coming. And I love having Soviet journalists on these microphones, particularly when the Soviet Union is being discussed. By the way, I presume you speak English just like Mr. Krivitskis does.
I hope better.
Oh, cut it out. Cut it out. How can you speak English better than you do? Utterly impossible. Невозможно. Where did you learn English?
In Moscow International Institute.
Explain what the International Institute is like. Here you are. Are you
this
from...
institute prepared Soviet diplomats and journalists in international affairs.
Okay, the only question I have before we even begin is what was the change and what caused the change? When did somebody snap a finger and say, Soviet journalists in America should learn how to come on talk shows? As I was growing up in radio, it was utterly impossible to get a Soviet journalist. You couldn't meet one. You couldn't meet one at a cocktail party at the embassy. You couldn't call one on the phone. You couldn't have lunch with a Soviet journalist. It was utterly... the thought of having a Soviet journalist on your radio or television show was absolutely impossible. And here, Mr. Krivitskas, on this early day in my life, I hope it's not near about half over yet, we call him, and absolutely without provocation, he calls you and brings you. Now, what year was it? What month was it? Who occasioned the change? When did it all of a sudden become not just possible to get Soviet journalists on the air, but possible for one of them to bring another one without any provocation?
As you see, we are without horns. We are normal people. We like to have a good relations with all nations on the earth, and especially with Americans.
Now, poor Vilas, this is not without its poetic value. You've melted me down. I'm sorry I left my Kleenex in my other pants, because I'd love to dab the tears of joy away from the edge of each eye. But are you telling me that all these years I was misperceiving, that all these years, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, there you were, and the only problem was we never invited you? Or was there a change?
I can't to talk about the time, very far time, but in these days, I mean, we had not easy situation in the relations between our countries in the last year especially. And I am glad to say that this evening it's the mark of further wishes to be close together. A few days ago, September 28th, I was attending the meeting of the Secretary of State, Mr. Haig, and our Foreign Minister, Mr. Gromyko. They were sitting on the sofa, very close, one to another. What was back 10, 20, 30 years ago, I would like to see in the future, and to say for you and for dear listeners this night, that let be better in the future.
If you will, let me just introduce my remaining panelists. Stuart Schwartzstein, State Department officer with the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. He's on temporary assignment with the U.S. Mission to the United Nations. John Gunderson, officer in the Bureau of International Organizational Affairs. Now that we've chosen up sides, when we reconvene, we'll play. Sterling Seagrave. His family lived in Burma since 1820. Really? Anyhow, Sterling Seagrave knows a lot about chemical warfare. His book, Yellow Rain, tells of Soviet development and usage of third-generation chemical weaponry. Now, what is third-generation chemical weaponry?
Barry, I think that chemical weapons fall into three categories pretty nicely if you consider that the ones that were used in World War I were basically synthetic chemicals, products of the dawn of the industrial age. These were things like chlorine and phosgene and mustard and, things like
those were World War I things.
That's right.
We studied them in World War... We Boy Scouts,
The Second World War, and you have a number of new ones being introduced. These are the nerve agents, and there are a variety of those. I think, have commonly thought that these were the most advanced right up to the present time. But none of these would, to my way of thinking, really explain the various mysterious stories that were coming out of Indochina 4, 5, 6 years ago. So, you had to look for something that could explain those medical symptoms. So it was in that area eventually that we hit upon some other agents that apparently are being used now, and these, therefore, must be considered third generation.
I watched the network television show. Nixon, when he was president, did in just plain old pulled the plug on our chemical warfare potential and let it all go down the drain while the Soviet Union builds happily ever after toward chemical warfare potential. Does this ring a bell?
Well, I don't really believe in the end that the Nixon ban, the famous Nixon ban 10 years ago, was true. I grant that my book concerns what appears to be the Soviet development of this new type of poisons. But the other half of the book concerns what appears to me to be a lot of fraud in the United States in the handling of our own chemical weapons. I think the Nixon ban was a fake.
The Nixon ban was a fake. In other words, we continued our potential.
Yes, I believe it's continued to the present time, not exactly in the same way. It simply went deeper underground so that a lot of the scientists moved from Fort Detrick out to the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah.
So your book is not plain old propaganda against the Soviet Union. You are complaining about their involvement in chemical warfare, and you say we are also guilty, and that, in fact, our so-called ban 10 years ago was fraudulent. I want to stop the music right now. I have very frequently wanted to jump out of my skin in spirit form, invade the body and brain of a guest, and know what he thinks. But I've never wanted to do that more than I do this very minute. We have two Soviet journalists in our chamber. They both speak English, and good English. Probably better than I do, which is not saying a great deal, but it's pretty good for Soviet journalists on duty in America. Now, when they heard you say just now that you, an American, on an American radio station, unedited, nobody watching you, unexpurgated, totally free, here you say into a live microphone, broadcasting out across the land that you think our ban on chemical warfare agents was fraudulent. What goes on in the Russian soul? What goes on in the Russian ear, in the Russian mind? Do they think to themselves, A, these Americans are suckers. How in the hell can you run a superpower with open microphones and unauthorized people being free to say my government is a fraud? What a wonderful thing. Or do they say, wow, imagine a country where this kind of thing can go. Do they think we're suckers, or does it engender some kind of deep envy and admiration? Would either of the Soviet journalists present like to answer that? You just heard an American say, I think my government was fraudulent. Now, you would never hear that on a Soviet radio station or in any communist country. What is your emotion? Are you going to pretend that you have zero emotion about it? Are you going to say, wow, what a terrific thing that somebody does that? Or are you going to say, what suckers you so-called bourgeois freedom lovers are? This freedom doesn't do you any good, and one day you'll learn your lesson.
And dear Barry, don't fly so high. I would like to say that you are not represent the Pentagon. We are only on the air of your radio program, and you are journalists like us.
Yeah.
And to ask us what we think about when we hear that one of American presidents was not right in the affairs of chemical weapons. You mean that we will answer that we never hear it? Yes, we hear that Nixon was not right, not only by chemical weapons, but by the Watergate too. It's not the new number one for us.
No, but wait.
You would like to ask me if I hear about it in the Soviet Union, about the Soviet government.
No bullfighter ever ran away from a bull more totally than you ran away from my questions, Povilas. You know my deep affection for you, but come on back gently and answer the question one way or the other. When you heard Mr. Seagrave say that when Nixon banned chemical warfare, he thinks that we were being fraudulent, did you say to yourself, A, nothing particular? Did you say, what stupid fools these bourgeois Americans are to come on and be allowed to criticize their government? Or did you say, wow, What a system, what a nation, where somebody with no censorship whatsoever can come on and say that his government was fraudulent, lied. Which of those three, if any, did you feel?
You see, it's a speculation to say that it's 3 points. I can collect maybe 100 points what I thought at this moment. And it's not the way to ask me from your speculation of 3 questions. I must say 100 questions what I thought at that second. It's not only your way of mind. I can build another one logical construction.
Oh, Vilas, I give your nation credit for helping us beat Adolf Hitler. I give your nation more credit than any other right-wing, anti-communist, conservative commentator is going to give your country. But you got to give my country a little credit, too. That was an unusual thing that just went on these microphones. It could not go on in the Soviet Union. It could not go on in most of the countries.
It will go. I am taping.
Yes, of course. Our criticism of America will undoubtedly go on over Soviet radio.
I will show for my colleagues.
Yes, yes.
Stick to our point.
Forgive me there. Yeah, we have the gentleman.
That's nothing bad. It's a discussion.
We have the correspondent from Pravda ready to testify. May I ask you please to hold your point?
To conceal my friend Krivitskus and me about so-called the using of chemical weapons by our forces, our friends, Vietnam, and so on. Dear listeners, maybe don't know that my country was the first country who signed Geneva Protocol in 1925. My country suggested in the United Nations 9 years ago, in 1972, to a draft convention that would have banned the development, production, and stockpiling of chemical weapons, as well as the destruction of the existing stocks in the Disarmament Committee of United Nations. So, as far as concerning not only Mr. Seagrave's book, Yellow Rain, but also statements of Mr. Haig, his deputy, Mr. Walter Stessel. Maybe the listeners don't know, Mr. Stessel was an ambassador in the Soviet Union 4 or 5 years ago. There is a lie. There is no evidence of using these third-generation chemical weapons in Vietnam, Cambodia, Afghanistan, and as far as in Yemen in the mid-60s. If I can speak, first of all, about, I've read very carefully your book, Mr. Seagrave, and first of all, I want to speak about so-called sources. First of all, about Cambodia.
By the way, America is out of step. We are the only country that says Cambodia. The rest of the world says Cambodia. Okay. We call it Cambodia.
Okay. Cambodia. Who is these sources? The bandits, Pol Pot bandits, who tried to exterminate all the people who had a policy of genocide and so on. In the beginning of your book, you mentioned, Mr. Seagrave, the name of Jack Schramm, who crosses Lao border in search of remains both of missing in actions. Soldiers, officers who were killed during in the China war. The first of his sources, as you in your book, Mr. Jack Schramm's sources, was about all this yellow rain in this area where 4 French mercenaries who were involved in drug business. Don't you think that it is very questionable, unreliable sources? So as Mr. Schramm himself, why? Maybe you read in the last issues of magazine Nation about one of his colleague who also unlawfully crosses Lao border in search of the remains of mission connections. If you don't mind, I'll read this very little clip from the last issue of Nation. So, still another efforts to find the remains of American servicemen missing in action in Laos has come to the end, and the operation may have blocked future negotiations on missing in actions between the governments of the two countries. So this is the question about another hunter for the remains of missing in actions, Robert Schwab, a former political and military analyst for the United States in Vietnam, who says he is now a private citizen, turned over to the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok the remains of 4 Americans. It was his version. Then, last month, the clips from Nation, the families learned, the families of these missing in actions learned that Schwab was fallible. The Pentagon quietly announced that an analysis by the U.S. Army Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii had demonstrated that the remains delivered by Schwab, as well as other remains brought out of Laos in August, also by Schwab, were of Asian, not Americans. So Schwab received the money from the families of missing in actions. It was a special fund helping him, and so on. And he cheated these people, American people. What's a shame? So it's a colleague of this person who you mentioned in your book, Jack Schramm. So about the information from Pol Pot bandits, Afghan bandits, I want to say another thing. Maybe American listeners don't know that in Peshawar, where the headquarters of these bandits,
Peshawar, is that
Peshawar, Pakistan, the representative of the Red Cross, Mr. Jean Monod, he is a Frenchman, said there is no evidence of using by the Soviet troops of chemical agents in the Afghanistan. He's a man who in charge of all hospitals in Peshawar, in the border, Afghan-Pakistan border.
Sure, I think that Mr. Tolkanov is correct in saying that one should not put too much weight in what French mercenaries say in the jungle. And the same is certainly true of Mr. Schwab. One must take this with a grain of salt. If occasionally you hear reports from people like that, nonetheless, I think it's fair to be curious and to say that my original curiosity about these reports from Laos was started by these fellows is not surprising. That's not the end of the book, however, and the book tells how I spent 4 years tracking down what I think is the truth, separated from these initial reports.
Okay, get closer and closer, if not to the answer, then at least to the question. Who on the planet Earth today is driving forward in chemical warfare more earnestly, the United States or the Soviet Union? Chemical warfare, and they have their notes and they make their points and they make their attacks. At no point is there any little salute saying, hey, glad you've got a free radio, glad you got a free microphone, glad we can come, glad we can participate. Sorry you can't do this in our country the way we can do it in your. Damn it, I would have you on every night. I'd love to have you on forever. You're the most fascinating of all possible people for anybody interested in what's going on in the world. But can't one of you give me at least one little tip of the hat for having the kind of country where we don't need anybody's permission to have you on live radio, where this can just go on? Are we going to pretend this point does not exist like so many stupid, blithering, myopic American liberals would? All I want is just say it one time, and I'll make a deal with you. I won't say, if you just say, Barry, yes, what a marvelous thing that in America you can have us Soviets on. No censors, no government, no permission. We didn't fill out any forms. It's not taped. Nobody told us what to say, what not to say. Yes, Barry, it's a great thing that in America you can do that. I'll make a deal. I promise you, I won't say it again for 18 months. 18 months from now, I may feel the need to say it again, but you can silence me. You can kibosh me. You can spike my guns for 18 months if one of you Soviets would just say, wow, what a country where you have this kind of freedom. Do we have any takers?
You have no takers. Well, it's basically a biological poison. That's how it's different from the poisons that have been used in warfare previously in this century. The other ones are basically synthetic chemicals, industrial chemicals. And these new ones are extracts from the bugs. These are not the bugs, but the bug juice. And these are called toxins. The particular toxins that we're referring to are from a group of fungus called Fusarium. And the Fusarium, in this case, has quite a few dozens of poisons, but we're talking only about 3. We're talking about T2 and nivalenol and deoxynivalenol, 3 of which were found in leaf samples after a battle in Cambodia last spring. And I understand today from several very highly placed sources in the U.S. government that in the last 2 weeks, a great deal of additional supportive evidence has come in, which the government regards as being absolute, and which they will release in the next 2 weeks or 3. Essentially, to boil it down into a nutshell, what would happen is you would begin to spaz out. You would start to have spasms. You would develop little hard blisters. Your skin would start to change color, and your insides would burst like a ripe orange being squeezed. You would drown in your own blood.
We have relatives here of the Bureau of International Organizational Affairs. Mr. Gunderson, could you lean in? You and I have exchanged some knowing smiles, and I know that you speak fluent Russian. Tell me a little bit more about you and your position.
I work with the International Organization Group in Washington. I'm up at the UN for the first political committee debate, and we work with various arms control issues, one of them being chemical warfare. I've just come back from Moscow, so I would welcome my Soviet friends here, and I'm glad they have the opportunity to talk, and many of their friends, journalists and diplomats, also talk on various shows. I would certainly have welcomed the opportunity in Moscow, and many times we did go into various Soviet papers, and diplomats and journalists. Unfortunately, we haven't had the opportunity. Perhaps someday we will have the opportunity to openly discuss these questions.
Am I an anti-communist monster? You sound like a neutral to me. Do you understand my desire just to get one smile from them, one wink, one acknowledgement that it's magnificent that we have a country where we can have this kind of show with nobody's permission?
Well, I think, having been in the Soviet Union, that many people who know the Russian and other people of the Soviet Union really have a warm spot for them, and they are very open and genuine people, certainly in private. The public face sometimes is a little different, and I don't think I have qualified to comment on
you and I still haven't gotten I haven't gotten my emotional requirement from this panel yet.
Svengali and Trilby will not play tonight.
Maybe I'll have to depend on David Schulte and my next of kin for what I require here. All I want is somebody to say, yes, in America, you can have Russians on. In the Soviet Union, you can't have Americans on. Now, come on, Barry, shut up and play ball. But until I get that,
you ain't going to get it.
I'm not quite requited. Do you understand what I'm talking about? Okay, fine. May I ask our last guest to sign the guest book, Stuart Schwartzstein?
Well, I've been very concerned with the issue. I've been the coordinator for refugee affairs for the East Asia Bureau, and in that capacity, I've spent time out in the refugee camps in Thailand.
Are you referring to the State Department?
Of the State Department.
Oh, yes, you haven't.
And I've talked to people who have witnessed attacks of what they identified as yellow rain, of powders of different colors, and they've described horrible deaths. And we've had continuing reports coming out of Cambodia, Laos, and Afghanistan of great numbers of people dying, as Sterling has described in his book. And those are indeed horrific deaths, and it's a tremendous problem, a problem for all of us. It's an international problem, and not one just for the United States. And we'd like to see this investigated as fully as possible.
Well, why don't you get a team to go in and investigate?
We have repeatedly gone into the Soviet government on a bilateral basis. We've done it many times at the very highest level. And we have not wanted to make this a politicized, contentious issue. We want to solve it. It's not an academic question. People are dying. We have not received any responses. The United Nations is now looking into the question of chemical warfare and chemical weapons use. This resolution was passed by overwhelming majority, and it was sponsored by many nations, and the United States strongly supported it.
I agree with you that the United Nations is the most important place for discussing of such problem with the serious provement. It must be proved in patterns which not discussed, that in such place, such country or government used the chemical weapon. The speculations only, the witnesses say that in something place we use the chemical weapon. It's not a document for the serious political discussion in United Nations. And we, with my colleague Andrei Tolkunov, must to say that only the documents, serious documents, with proving of the cases of using chemical weapons can be put on the table of United Nations, and only in that place we can seriously discuss this problem. I very thank Mr. Barry for invitation to this discussion, but we are discussing here very, I would like to say privately. It's not the main political table of our earth. It's only one of the studio of New York. And so frequently repeating that in our America we can so openly discuss these problems, it's not the fact who can prove me that so everything are so free in your lovely America.
I'll make a deal with you, Povilasu. You're right, I'm just one station. I'm just one show on one station. I will lay my sword at your feet when you pick the smallest radio station in the smallest town in the Soviet Union. You can pick a station in my favorite towns, Krivoy Rog, Bryansk, Smolensk, Veliki Luki, Zhitomir. Pick the smallest town in the Soviet Union and get me speaking Russian, or better yet, my friends over here from the State Department who speak much better Russian than I do. Let us speak freely on your smallest radio station in your smallest town, and then I will say, yes, your jape is justified. Soviet Union arming for chemical warfare. Is America arming for chemical warfare? Who is lying? And if both are lying, who is lying more dangerously for the rest of the world? These are some of the questions raised by Sterling Seagrave between covers of his book, Yellow Rain. I don't know if that book is going to be translated into Russian. I don't know if it's going to be available to the Soviet people. I don't know if this same broadcast is going to go on over Russian radio or not, but it's going on here, and that's all I can care about right now. David Schulte has convinced me to give up my narrow-minded emotional requirements of having the Russians say, "Hey, Barry, congratulations for living in a country where you can do this with the other side. Wish we had that kind of place." It's the last I'm going to mention that for 18 days. If only I would get a signal from the other side, I'd give up for 18 months. But I'm not going to get one, so here we go. Stuart Shortstein, State Department Officer, Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. John Gunderson, officer in the Bureau of International Organizational Affairs. Potent to believe the Soviets are using chemical agents.
Yes, I really believe that spokesmen for the International Red Cross are in a cleft stick. They're not in a position to be able to make clean-cut announcements on any subject, although I think they're very fair and generous people. They cannot afford the political fallout that would come from making a bald-faced remark. Essentially, I think we have confirmatory evidence in the government's hands right now of lethal agents being used in Afghanistan. The only question is, which lethal agents are they?
May I say, in case you're interested in fashion, that the official American delegation present here is dressed co-equally to the official Soviet delegation. Both Soviets are in normal business suits with shirts and neckties. The American delegation does it differently. One is in a sweater and no necktie, but the other's in a tuxedo. So I judge that as parity. Around the conference table, that is equality. Mr. Gunderson.
Well, I'm the one in the sweater. We had to have our capitalist representative there. Well, I think the important thing now is not to sling mud around, but to get an investigation. I do note that the Soviet Union did not vote with the impartial UN investigation of chemical warfare charges, both in Afghanistan and Southeast Asia. And if these charges are lies, as our Soviet friends had said, I think they would welcome an open investigation in both these areas. And this is all we're asking for, and we've submitted 125 pages and more of evidence. There have been innumerable journalists, diplomats, businessmen from all countries who have been in this area, and almost all of them, after having spoken to these people, will confirm that something's happening. And we just want them to look into these allegations.
Perhaps our Soviet friends would care to comment on the idea of the UN experts panel making an on-site investigation in Afghanistan, in Cambodia, and in Laos.
Okay, fair enough.
I think that there is a lot of things to investigate in Afghanistan.
Mr. Tolkanov,
for example, of using of the bandits of American made by in the United States gas bombs. There is a lot of evidences of this, and Afghan Afghan government suggested to have an international panel on this issue, and Afghan government want to investigate.
Well, there is a UN experts panel on chemical warfare, and then I think are we not then in agreement that they ought to visit Afghanistan?
Yes, there is. I'd like one thing. Some months ago, the State Department began a campaign around the so-called support by the Soviet Union and our friends of international terrorism. And yesterday, New York Times published a very interesting article which said that all information which used Mr. Haig is based on the information 10 years ago. There were information from one Czech general who betrayed his motherland. This information, Czechoslovakia. This information was used by Miss Krell-Sterling in her book Terror Network. New York Times said that administration said CIA to prepare a special report on the issue of reporting by the Soviet Union and our friends international terrorism, but no real evidence. So why we can have some commission on the issue of using by the Soviet Union and our friends chemical weapons?
No, wait. Don't you Soviets openly support terrorism. You are on the side of Fidel Castro, who sends Cuban soldiers to destabilize regimes in Africa. You are on the side...
only helping these regimes.
Only
what?
Helping regimes. Like you're helping Afghanistan.
To help
like you
Angola
like
against aggression from the South Africa.
I understand.
At least we turn from Afghanistan to Cuba. And I would like to remind for colleagues here that the foreign minister of Cuba, only a few weeks ago, from the high level of UN, said about 5 epidemical cases in Cuba of African fever, yeah? Yes, it's very cruel illness.
And you're blaming you're blaming that on American chemical warfare.
That's right.
Not only, but their own public health authorities have said other things.
Okay,
Sorry,
you explain
it's not only Soviets or Cuban who condemn American for this illness. There is a very interesting book just published as Mr. Sterling's books, Yellow Rain. This book is written by two journalists, Warren Hinckley and William Turner. The book is The Fish is Red, the story of the secret war against Castro. It's very interesting information, this book, how they want to kill Castro, to use some fever and so on against Cuba. Very interesting book.
Before we leave this point, are you not on the side of the PLO, and does not the PLO openly use terror? Are you not on the side of Muammar Gaddafi, and does Gaddafi not openly use terror? So when you criticize Claire Sterling for saying the Soviet Union is the world's homeland for terror, why do you criticize her? She is merely observing what you openly profess, and that is support for terrorists.
For official Washington, these forces is the forces of the international terrorism. For us, it's a national liberation movement.
So what we call international terrorism, the PLO, Muammar Gaddafi, Fidel Castro, what we call international terrorism, you call wars of liberation. It is useful that you came to these microphones. It is useful that you say that. Krivitskas inspired my next question by his fist in the air, communist pep rally style proclamation that we, the Soviet Union, are helping governments from Cuba to Afghanistan maintain their freedom and their liberation. Let me ask you a question. We, America, we are helping democracies, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, France, the British Isles, we're helping Austria, we're helping Israel, we're helping Australia, New Zealand, Japan, we're helping all the democracies. Name one democracy the Soviet Union is helping. And you ask me what I mean by democracy. I mean by democracy a nation where the people elect the leaders and where any common citizen can look the leader in the face and tell him to go to hell and not get sent to a gulag. That's what I mean by a democracy. Name one democracy you people are supporting.
As you remember, I asked you how you understand the word
how I define democracy. Yes. A nation where you have a free press, free speech, freedom.
And free crime, too.
Absolutely.
And Joe McCarthy era.
Oh, absolutely. And what?
Joe McCarthy era.
And Joe McCarthy?
Era, yes.
Joe McCarthy era?
Yes. 20 years ago.
It comes with ill grace, sir. It comes with ill grace that you criticize the so-called Joe McCarthy era at a time when you were experiencing Joseph Stalin, another Joe in another era. Anyhow, a democracy is a country that has freedom of egress. You can leave if you don't like it. Habeas corpus, an independent judiciary, constitutional guarantees, freedom to make whatever of your life you are able to economically, go into business, employ people. Awful lot of freedoms. I think, Povilas, that you know good and well what I mean by democracy, and I challenge you to tell me one democracy the Soviet Union supports.
Okay. At first, we have our viewpoint of democracy, of Soviet socialist viewpoint, what is it? Democracy.
I knew you'd say
democracy for us is the equal rights for living style, for possibilities to be educated, to be cured, and so on, for all of our people in our country. I, like a son of very huge family, I grew in the family of 5 children. It's a large number of children, yes, and all of us, my brothers, my sisters are educated in the universities and the institutes, and no one kopeck or penny was paid for our education. And another things you know in our system, which are for all of the members of our society. It's the top. Of our democracy, and I am proud to be the representative of my country, of Soviet Union, which usually you call Russians. It's not right, because we are compared of 100 nations in our country. Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, and so on and so on.
How many would there be?
And
how many would there be if they were free?
The first country of our democracy is Soviet Union, at first. And another countries of our bloc, as you say. And in spite of mistakes, in spite of very difficult things of creation of our system, we will create it further. I would like to say it in a very normal voice, with congratulations to all Americans who try to understand us, who are not against us, you know.
Well, I congratulate the Polish Solidarity Union, which understands you better than the Americans who you congratulate for understanding you. I haven't heard you congratulate the freedom forces in Poland right now. I haven't heard you congratulate
Excuse me.
Dubček in
Solidarity. So ordinary thing that
you're
you
damn
can't
right it's
say
not. That's what I love
that you
about it.
congratulate only solidarity. I congratulate the very difficult efforts of Polish Workers' Party. I congratulate it.
The Polish Workers' Party?
Yeah, it's the Communist Party, but it names... Yeah, Don't interrupt me. Let me say what I think. Прошу.
Okay.
It's in Lithuanian. Barry says, I beg your pardon. I answered, okay, we can go further. And as you know, we are, in many things, we are not agreed with solidarity. This movement, which was signed with the government of Polish a year only ago, it's crooked to the another side of these agreements. You can take a look at these papers, which we are signed only a year ago with the leadership of among the leadership of Solidarity and the government of, and they don't obey that agreements. You know,
you scare the hell out of me.
It's a very complicated thing to say ordinary that I obey I admire solidarity. That's all. That's not so easy. Ordinary thing,
right,
dear Barry.
When we get back together, I want to tell you why you scare me more than the Soviet Union or any other dictatorship has ever scared me in my lifetime, and that includes the late Adolf Hitler. The reason you scare me so much is because you have made a determination in the Kremlin or somewhere that the time is now right where you can come in plain English before an American audience and make points by saying, I am one of 5 children in a poor Lithuanian family. All of us went to school. We are educated. What a system. And you could go on and say how little rent you pay, and you could go on and say how little you pay for medical care, and you could talk about your great Soviet system. And you feel that the time is right where Americans will sit back and say, maybe there's something to that. In other words, you think that our own nerve, that this propaganda nerve gas is going to be effective because we are so beaten down, so depressed with our own system, so forgetful of history, so inured with our own crime, so pessimistic about our own future. you think the time is right that we will forget about the difference between freedom and dictatorship and start getting sentimental about your claims that, and I'm sure you're right, that you and your 5 brothers and sisters went to the university free. It scares me that somebody on your side, on the Soviet side, thinks that we are now ready to listen attentively and perhaps wistfully and enviously to your claims.
These huge, big countries are preparing for the Third World War. Because Mr. Nixon, in his book, The Real War, many times repeated this theme about the possibilities of World War III. And I think that it's not necessary to repeat so many times this terrible term. He's saying about Soviet preparing to the poison gas war. No, we are doing researchings of gas, but not for the war purposes. We are doing researching in our north areas from the gas for the people. You know it. And it's a very big industry.
You're saying that your gas warfare, your gas research and your chemical research is for peaceful purposes?
Yes. The gas which used in the kitchen.
He means heating gas.
Heating gas, that's right.
No research in mycotoxins.
Maybe scientists know how is working microtoxins, but the preparing for the war purposes, I can't believe.
I think Sterling.
I would like to say that it doesn't seem to me that the immediate movement here with these new poisons is toward World War III, but in this particular case, to use these new poisons to wipe out groups in remote parts of the world. It's used, in essence, to intimidate small groups of people who cannot defend themselves against it. Up until this time, there has been no concrete evidence. Now we have some laboratory evidence beginning to come in. I would like to suggest that these 2 gentlemen who have gone to so much trouble to pore through the book and to find what they consider to be its flaws, if they would like to present the list of these questions to me, I'd be happy to take the time in the next couple of weeks to answer them point by point. In the meanwhile, when the U.S. government in the next several weeks releases its laboratory evidence, I would like very much to urge them to reply to that and to prove that this laboratory evidence is not true in Afghanistan, in Kampuchea, or in Laos. I'd like to see the supporting evidence to denounce that. Then I would be very happy. If the Soviet Union is innocent, then I would be delighted.
Mr. Seagrave, what sort of laboratory evidence the State Department will show to the public opinion? Now we know that there is only one stock from the Cambodian Thailand border.
Well, this is really not it's not the case. This was deceptive, you see, because actually the samples that were obtained in the area south of Aranya Pratet were more than just a leaf and a branch. There were quite a few branches from trees and also clothing, water samples, soil samples, plus the fact that the Vietnamese attack was observed by international observers from the border. So, this is the beginning, and the remaining evidence will be presented only next week or the week after.
But as far as I know, even American scientists said that this sort of mushroom of mycotoxin may be found in the soil near the State Department.
Well, you're speaking
of the NBC.
Yes, you're speaking of Dr. Messelson.
And I also read in the English newspaper Observer that T2, which you meant T2. It's in Russia.
It's Mexico too. Big language.
Is a mycotoxin derived from the fungus family, one of the most common component on the planet. It is typically found in the mold of poorly stored wheat, canals, and it is this substance often responsible for turning lawns brown by killing the grass, which is then eaten by the fungus.
What are you reading from? What are you reading from?
From the English newspaper Observer. And I also heard on this program, TV program, NBC TV program, that this sort of poison components, sometimes you can meet it even in the food in the United States.
Yes, this is, you're right, it is all over the world. It's a very common fungus. Everybody has trouble with it. However, somebody has extracted it, refined it into a white crystalline powder, and is dumping it on the heads of people. That's where the problem lies. Secondly, the fusarium fungus does grow everywhere in the world, but in order to produce these three poisons, it must go through freezing and thawing, and you don't have freezing in Indochina. So it's brought there from somewhere else.
Will be never use the gas.
Povilas,
Yes, my dear.
you knocked me out. Here you are lamenting the extermination of Jews, and you work for a regime which represses Jews systematically.
Barry, you are not right. In Soviet Union, the Jews have a most high level of the university education. They are not
Highest level.
Yeah, highest.
But they can't leave Russia. And they can't live as Jews.
It's another thing. We have a lot of Jews, and my close friend who are not leaving Russia, Lithuania. I'm proud to know, to be in good relations with them. And it's a very dirty political trick to say that all Jews in the Soviet Union don't prefer the Soviet style of life.
No, let's be precise.
Here is the lie.
Let's be precise. I agree with you. There are many Soviet Jews happy in the Soviet Union if they don't particularly care about
They have even the Republic Biirobidzhan, you know it.
Oh, they're very happy there. Oh, now wait.
Yes.
Who wants the Republic to believe that? Folks, the volcano has gone off.
Only Israel and Biirobidzhan is the separate states of Jews. Here you have the state of Jews in the United States.
Folks, I am glad I'm still young. I am glad I could not have taken what I just heard. Let me tell you what Povilas Krivitskas...
I don't think you're that young.
Maybe I can't take it. Once upon a time, when the Soviet Union was young and they wanted to counter the influence of the Russian, of Zionism, the outside force pulling Russian Jewish loyalty away from the Soviet Union, the Russians did something clever. They built their own Israel in the Far East, in Biirobidzhan, on the border of Manchuria. There is something which to this very day carries the incredible name of the Autonomous Soviet Jewish Republic.
Socialist
Republic. Well, Biirobidzhan, folks, started out weak and gradually tapered off. It never attracted Soviet Jews. It's a potted plant. It's a stage show. It's a Soviet communist card trick. And here, when we are talking about something as real as Soviet, let me be precise, not extermination. You do not exterminate Jews. You repress Jews. You deny Jews freedom to live as Jews, freedom to gain access to higher reaches of Soviet society insofar as they practice their Judaism. You deny them freedom to leave except as you
at
prefer
this time
to
you
give them
repressed
little
us
visas.
with Andrew.
Wait a minute. But you've got the nerve. You've got the nerve at this late stage in history to bring up what I thought was now a comedy routine, namely Biirobidzhan, which hasn't been mentioned with a straight face by any American communist since 1938.
You are not right. No, you are wrong. You are right.
Again, I believe this has happened to me. On a live American radio show, a Soviet journalist says, Barry, we don't repress Jews. Look at Biirobidzhan, the autonomous Soviet Jewish Socialist Republic on the Manchurian border.
Don't forget yourself. You are becoming a communist, I see.
What?
You are becoming a communist. You are using our propaganda.
Well,
okay, that's right. Thank you, Barry.
Well, look, I'm sorry. Mr. Gunderson, the last quick word. We're about to wind up shop right now.
I'm reminded of George Orwell's book, Animal Farm, and there's a little statement that says, in effect, that all people are equal. Some are more equal than others, however. And having been there and seen the special stores and the special schools and the special hospitals, not to mention special lanes for certain officials, it's hard to believe a discussion about equality.
Well, we will have discussions about equality as long as we're conducting not unilateral disarmament, but unilateral invitation. I don't care if I never get invited to speak over Radio Moscow. I want Povilas Kravitskas and Andrei Tolkonov to come soon and often. Sterling Seagrave's book, Yellow Rain, we'll be discussing it soon and often. Talk about. We've got one more item on the agenda, thanks to sloppy navigation of a Russian submarine. I join half of Sweden right now. I like to think it's more than half. We heard a news report earlier today that told about that Russian submarine that ran aground in Swedish waters where no Russian submarine could innocently run aground. I mean, if this were not serious business with nuclear warheads poised, it reminds me of that old joke where the guy opens his bedroom closet and his wife is in bed yawning and sleeping and snoring and everything. Opens his closet and there's a naked man in there. And the irate husband says, what in the hell are you doing here? And the guy said, Myron Cohen story. The guy says, sheepishly, everybody's got to be someplace. Well, I guess that Russian submarine had to be someplace, even if it is weaseled and wormed and countersunk into Swedish territorial waters. Let me tell you what I love about that incident. I've got a lot to lose in Sweden. I don't want to be flippant about it. But I am overjoyed at a public relations aspect of this Soviet submarine in Sweden. Sweden is one of these difficult... I'm glad conservatives like Bill Rusher and Bill Buckley are rooted in America. I think they would go clinically insane if they were in Sweden. If they think they have liberal insanity to contend with in America, they would not last one round in Sweden, because Sweden is totally incontinent in matters like this. In Sweden, everything America does is wrong and rotten. Forget Vietnam and Watergate. That's the obvious. But everything America does is at best suspect. At worst, we're the new Nazis. And Russia, right there, you never bring up in Sweden because it's bad taste. And for 35 years, this has been the drumbeat in Swedish life, Swedish television, Swedish radio, Swedish newspapers, Swedish universities, Swedish dinner parties. If you criticize the Soviet Union, you're just plain old guilty of bad taste. If you criticize America effectively, man, you are the hero of the evening. And I've put up with this for about 25 or 30 trips to Sweden. I'll continue to put up with it for very deep and valid personal reasons. Anyhow, what a delight. It's always been my theory. And I say never believe a fact unless it's supported by a theory. It's always been my theory that given a flat field and a sunny day and about 10 feet of normal water, and the Swedes, too, will realize that America is the decent power and the Soviet Union is the dangerous power. We got to get over Vietnam. We got to get over Watergate. We got to get over Autherine Lucy. Back in the 50s, the black who was denied entry to the University of Alabama. You got to get over that and let the water run normally for about 10 feet, the way the water of the world runs. And then even the Swedes would wake up and realize who's who. This did it. The Soviets have blown 35 years of propaganda advantage and propaganda momentum and the natural neutral inclinations of the Swedes away from war and nuclear war and America and CIA and rearmament and everything. Why do they criticize America? Because we're easy and we're decent. Why do they shut up about Russia? Because they know in their gut work that Russia is the menace and it's easier to attack the good guy than the bad guy. This little submarine has blown the top off the volcano all across Sweden. The mask is off. And the Swedes who were with us in World War II, in their hearts, Sweden was neutral. The Swedes who realized there are two forces in the world, one aggressive, that's the Soviet, one occasionally reactive to that aggression, and that's led by America. They now realize what is what. Nothing like a good old Soviet submarine running aground to be the lightning and thunder that purifies the atmosphere after 35 years of inspired left-wing, ritualistic, knee-jerk, pro-Soviet and anti-America orientation. I do not say to those Swedes who came over to our side within the past 12 hours, where were you during the Hungarian Revolution? I do not say to them, where were you during the Prague Spring? I do not say to them, where were you during the invasion of Afghanistan? I learned my lesson. I say to those Swedes, welcome, brother. Perhaps you can participate in the defense of the still free democracies against the one power capable to engulf us all. Says, I can't steal it when he's present. And matter of fact, I got too much honor to steal it even when he's not present. But we owe a vote of thanks to Joe Sobran in his column for distinguishing between public opinion and popular sentiment. See, public opinion and popular sentiment are not Siamese twins. They hardly ever meet each other.
I stole myself there. So
Walter Lippmann, I think, right?
No,
John Lucan.
No, let me state, I want to learn from the misguided and catastrophic backfiring anti-communism of the 50s. I think anti-communism is much too important a mission to bungle again. It took us 30 years to get another chance to reapproach the American people with the basic differences between the Soviet system and the free world system. And this time I don't want to go down with any 5 o'clock shadow man pulling secret lists out of his pocket and alienating everybody, offending basic American senses of good sportsmanship. Okay, now, all I'm going to say is this. You're not going to get me to point a bony finger of indignation at any columnist, any senator. Forget it. I'll merely say that I suspect as a viewer that most people I view enjoy West Germans rampaging against NATO than Polish workers organizing against Soviet oppression. It's just my hunch.
But in truth,
it can, like that comic said about World War II. You've heard of World War II. It was in all the papers. I would not give the American press a medal merely for concentrating on the first cosmic, breathtaking, if Joseph Stalin were alive, he'd drop dead. Polish workers negotiating with the Communist Party, and there's a summit meeting, tripartite, three-way summit meeting, the Communist Party, the Catholic Church, and Solidarity, and the Soviet delegation is waiting across the street, just like the American press, to find out what goes on inside that meeting. This deserves a couple of column inches, doesn't it? It showed Germans fighting Americans more than they enjoy good stories of Polish workers fighting Russians.
I think it's not a case of pro-Soviet sympathy. I think it's a case of fear of the Soviet Union. That's the determining factor in a way, because there's this tremendous desire to sort of appease the Soviet Union and not to provoke them. You hear that word provocative, used as a swear word or a boo word against Brzezinski or someone like that. Haig, of course, Reagan himself. This notion that the Soviet Union is something so dreadful, so terrible, not something good, but something so terrible, like a monster, that it's morally blameworthy to attack it, to enrage it, because you start endangering everyone. Threat to détente, that sort of thing. warmongering.
This same
solidarity, there's been, on the one hand, a desire to see solidarity prosper, a desire for a kind of peaceful, autonomous solution to the big Soviet problem, the idea that it's not monolithic, it's not really that fearsome, it'll destroy itself or fall apart somehow. And on the other hand, there's also this anxiety about us getting involved in it. You know, there was talk of the Polish crisis as if it were our crisis, and the idea that stability is a desirable thing there. It depends from what point of view you desire stability.
Don't forget,
I think that we actually have had a lot of neglect in this area. I mean, there was a Ernest Lefebvre's group, the Ethics and Public Policy Center, a few years ago, did a survey just to count, and they found that over a 2-year period, the CBS Evening News gave exactly 2 minutes to the Soviet military buildup, when it was really, going on apace. It was the biggest military buildup in history. Is. And, I mean, this is fantastic. We're being told, and that's the way it is every night, and we didn't get a clue. I mean, this is turning out to be potentially the big story of all time, and where was it?
Let's go through
an aggression sometimes, because, if two parties are laying claim to the same territory, neither one of them will obviously agree that what they do is aggression. Gaddafi doesn't think taking over Chad is aggression. At least he won't admit it. The Soviets have a certain way of operation that, plays on our sense of ambiguity about all this stuff. They supply what they regard as the progressive forces with advisors and materiel and everything. And then we keep hearing the word indigenous. It's just indigenous. We heard that the Khmer Rouge were an indigenous force in Cambodia, and the guerrillas in El Salvador are indigenous. Of course they're indigenous. The thing is, they have a lot more leverage because they have Soviet support. It's very hard to find the right term to define these things, I think.
Such as in El Salvador, will be played up very, very big. We're going to be spending so much money. We're lying to you. We're not really telling you how many troops we're going to send in. We're doing this. Somebody said this today and somebody said that today, so we really don't know what the true story is. It's the way the media plays it up. The U.S. is really the bad guy, the ogre in the entire situation, because we're going against the indigenous forces in El Salvador. We're going against the indigenous forces in Colombia, wherever. But those indigenous forces are heavily supported by the Soviet Union. They are not truly indigenous from that point of view because they're being pushed by an outside power. That side never does get played up. There's always skepticism about, every leftist organization is said to be supported by the Soviet Union. We can't print that.
Tommy's under the bed.
Right, that kind of nonsense. But part of it is from fear, because I do agree that there are people who sit there and they're left-leaning on domestic issues. They're not communist sympathizers by any means. I don't think the media is a communist sympathizer or want to see the communists getting ahead. They believe in social programs. But they also have this fear about, we really incite the people, get them really scared about this communist threat. We're going to be back in the 1950s again. In a trigger-happy age, and all you have to do is push that button, goodbye. The fear is there, and the fear is very, very real.
42, I read just today, the Germans sank 240 Allied ships in the Caribbean. They did not have a base west of France. Their subs had to cross the ocean to do that. The Soviets already have a base in Cuba. They're getting more bases in Nicaragua. They're going to have bases in El Salvador at the rate things are going. They're really closing in. It's like a chess game, as I was saying before the program. They've got all the big pieces in place. We're going to have to lay down the king one of these days unless we do something soon. It's not a matter of manhood. It's a matter of survival. Just anything. But I'm saying this is a real problem, and you've got to do something besides bluster on the one side and deplore macho ethos on the other. Hold it.
Joe Sobran. You've heard him on CBS. He's senior editor of National Review. His columns distributed nationally through the Los Angeles Times syndicate ship. We did a broadcast on this just the other day, David. We learned that what we did do about the Dominican Republic, now it can be told, was a thoroughly praiseworthy, life-saving, majestic mission on the part of a humanitarian superpower that did not want an insanely violent civil war to destroy a neighbor. The Marines went in. The Marines stayed for a while. Tempers cooled. There was an election. Constitutional government was restored. And I don't expect Ken Auletta to put on a tuxedo and fly to the Dominican Republic to give an ADA award to the junta. But, I mean, it's a lot better than it would have been had we not intruded. We never get credit for Marines not going. At the time, it was a typical Theodore Roosevelt, gunboat diplomacy, looking for an excuse to intervening. Now, where is the yelling now that this many years have gone by and none of those accusations against America turns out to be true?
You forgot to add that the reason, allegedly, for the invasion of the Marines was...
I forgot. No, you remembered it, so you tell it.
The imminent invasion by Castro of the Dominican Republic.
Yeah, the source is Stanley Ross, who has been the editor of every Spanish-language publication in the United States and whose friends spanned from Trujillo, Batista, Franco, clear over to Jose Torres on the other political side. Jose Torres, the light heavyweight boxing champ of the world. Stanley really had his contacts. He had his information. I've known him for 20 years. I trust at least that Stanley Ross believes that story himself. Maybe, without sacrificing our beautiful democratic principles, we should change the rules a little. I mean, doesn't Mexico need us in some way? Can't we twist enough arms so that the Mexicans, whatever they want to say in their pep rallies, cease and desist from overtly aiding the El Salvador rebels? But, this broadcast down in shorthand, strike out where I said twisting arms. I thought I was, among fellows of like mind, and they would accept my shorthand.
You mean something like what Mrs. Kirkpatrick did at the UN the other day, write a personal letter to all these ambassadors who voted in favor of these outrageous resolutions and then come to her privately and say, we didn't mean it. She put him on the spot.
I understand. What I mean, the President of the United States telling the President of Mexico, look, there is a great clamor in America for us to do at least as much to aid the causes of true democracy around the world as the Soviets are doing to aid the cause of true totalitarian communism. We're not going to do that much that quick. We might rock a boat, but we're going to move in that direction. Now, we favor constitutional government, not Castro repression in El Salvador, and we are going to do everything we can to bring that about. We don't run Mexico. We can urge you, if you can't see your own way clear, to join us in that mutual self-interest, which is the way we perceive it, and at least understand if you're going to go ahead and make these statements, if you're going to go ahead and open your borders, if you're going to go ahead and help the people we consider as a destabilizing force in El Salvador, then we will be forced to reconsider our opinions on the following shopping list. That's all. Open, above board, no violence. We're never going to bomb Tijuana. But we are going to start moving in the direction of doing as much for our side, which is democracy. I mean, it's not like one side has green jerseys, the other's gold jerseys. I'm very proud that we represent what we represent in the world. And I don't see why in the world the State Department has to go into cardiac arrest when somebody suggests dropping flashlight batteries to the Afghan freedom fighters.
Because the New York Times may editorially disapprove.
Power is over the rest of the media.
Right.
The truth of the matter is that the New York Times is the assignment editor for the networks. The networks determine what to cover that night based on what's in the New York Times, and to a lesser extent, and to an important extent, in the Washington Post as well.
The trade magazine editor and publisher. Every week you'll see ads, full-page ads the New York Times takes out, showing you an editor of some newspaper way out in the Midwest or some other place. If you've never heard of the place, you've never heard of the paper, saying he will not start his day, will not start planning his paper until he's read the New York Times. Cy Hirsch's long diatribe on the CIA, the first piece that he put out, forgetting everything that may have followed, and the Church Committee and any revelations and the rest of it, that story went on and on and on endlessly for several thousand words. Towards the middle of the story, in one small little paragraph, Hirsch had a disclaimer saying that he had not been able to confirm most of the information in the story with any other source, other than one source. That never appeared up front, but the Times gave it 4,000 words. I mean, go back to the original story, you'll see it. Now, forget about whether it was all true later on, down the line. Right then and there, that should have been up front. It was very serious
if it
allegation.
wasn't, it should have been.
Let's not give it that kind of play. But you find that very often in New York Times stories. There's always a slant. Now, I'll take that back. That's too generalized.
I think it is.
There is often a slant in a New York Times story, and you can't get slants out. No matter how fair I try to be fair when I write. I try very, very hard. But I have feelings. I have beliefs, and somehow they're going to creep in. I'm really going to believe this guy's side rather than the other guy's side, and it's not going to weigh as much.
There's a cosmology that works itself out in the choice of news stories a lot of times. People who take a view that the world is just generally behaving in a progressive direction are going to see certain news stories that come over the wire as illustrating their points. They're going to give those emphasis, and there's going to be, as a result, a kind of quality in the general reporting of that paper, no matter how fair-minded the reporters and editors are, that will, to other people who don't share that cosmology, look like bias. That's what happens in the New York Times. There's also something a little bit more grubby, I'm afraid, now and then. I could name a few reporters that I just think are terribly biased, who are very, they're star reporters in the Times.
Why be shy?
I don't know. I just don't want to be invidious and so on.
Not like you, Joe.
Well, I mean, if I had the text in front of me, I would. But...
Well, talk.
But Ben Bradlee wrote a book called Conversations with Kennedy. Ben Bradlee is known as the king of investigative journalism as a result of the Watergate investigation. He revealed himself unwittingly, I guess, in this book as the prince of discretionary journalism. He had withheld from the public some awfully scandalous stories about John Kennedy. In fact, he was involved in one or two of them himself.
Well, that's a good reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He was sitting in the White House and with the president and several other people and discussing things that they were going to do that the president wanted done against certain reporters.
IRS information, that sort of thing.
Right, which, of course, he later condemned Richard Nixon for doing and really went after.